Never told him about the properties. Not once. Not even close. And the night he sat across from me at our kitchen table with a folder full of documents he printed behind my back, I was so glad I hadn't. Let me back up. I was 63 when I met him. My name is Vera, and I had been a widow for 4 years by that point. My first husband, Ron, passed from a sudden cardiac event in the spring of 2019. We'd been married 31 years. He was the kind of man who fixed things without being asked. The leaky tap, the cracked fence post, the silence at dinner when I'd have a hard day. Losing him didn't just break my heart, it rearranged everything I thought I knew about my own life. For the first 2 years after Ron died, I barely left the house except for groceries and my Thursday walks with my friend Heloise along the waterfront in Port Credit. Heloise had lost her own husband a decade earlier, and she had this way of just letting me be sad without trying to fix it. That helped more than anything. What helped even more, though I didn't see it that way at the time, was work. Ron and I had bought our first investment property together back in 1998, a modest semi-detached in Mississauga. We rented it out, saved what we earned, and bought a second one in 2004, a detached bungalow near the GO station in Oakville. Near the Jouch bungalow near the GO station in Oakville. By the time Ron passed, we owned 3 rental properties outright, no mortgages, paid off. I had kept the books for all 3 for years because Ron always said I had a better head for numbers than he did, which I think was his way of saying he didn't like spreadsheets. After Ron was gone, I kept managing everything myself. Tenants, maintenance, the HST filings every year, the conversations with our property manager, Dolores, when something needed attention. It gave me a reason to get up, to think, to feel useful. My daughter, who lives in Halifax with her family, worried I was burying myself in work to avoid grief. Maybe she was right. But the work also kept me solvent, independent, and, eventually, okay. I was not looking for anyone when I met him. His name was Stuart. He was 67, retired from 25 years in municipal planning, recently divorced, and he had the kind of easy confidence that comes from a lifetime of being good-looking and knowing it. We met at a fundraising dinner for the Mississauga Food Bank. A friend had an extra ticket, and I went mostly because I hadn't been to anything social in months, and I was beginning to feel like I was disappearing into my own house. We ended up at the same table. He asked what I did. I said I managed some rental properties. He nodded and said that sounded smart. He didn't ask how many, didn't ask where, and at the time I appreciated that. It felt like respect. Later, I would understand it differently. We dated for 8 months before he proposed. I want to be honest about this part because I think it matters. I genuinely liked him. He made me laugh. He cooked, not just barbecue, but actual meals, roast chicken and lentil soup, and this lemon pasta he'd learned from a cooking class he took after his divorce. He drove me to my eye appointments without making it a big deal. He remembered things I mentioned in passing and brought them up weeks later. When I told him I miss Ron, he didn't get defensive. He just said, "Tell me about him." And then he listened. I fell for that. I think that was the point. I did not tell Stuart how much the properties were worth. I told him I had rental income, that I was comfortable, that I didn't need anything from him financially. He said the same. He had his pension from the city, his own house in Streetsville that he owned, and some RRSP savings. We talked about money in general terms, the way you do when you're both adults and you're trying to be sensible about it. He seemed sensible. He seemed like a man with enough of his own. What I kept to myself, the properties were generating about $68,000 a year in net rental income after expenses. The 3 of them together were worth, conservatively, just under $2 million at current market values. I had a will, a power of attorney, and a separate corporate account that the properties ran through. Ron and I had set it up that way years ago on the advice of our accountant. I didn't hide this because I was planning to deceive Stuart. I want to be very clear about that. I kept it vague because I had watched over the years the way money changes people's behavior, subtly, gradually, in ways they sometimes don't even notice themselves. I had seen it with my late brother-in-law, who turned cold the moment he found out what Ron and I had saved. I had seen it with a neighbour of mine who remarried at 65 and found herself, 2 years later, watching her new husband make financial decisions that included her assets and excluded her assets and excluded her opinion. I was 63 years old, and I had built something. I wanted to know first who I was really dealing with. We married in September, a small ceremony at a winery in Niagara-on-the-Lake. My daughter came with her husband and the kids. Heloise was my witness. Stuart's son from his first marriage flew in from Calgary, and his daughter drove up from Hamilton with her partner. Everyone was warm. Everyone smiled. I remember the light on the vines that afternoon and thinking, maybe this is good. Maybe this is allowed. His daughter's name was Renata. She was 38, worked in real estate, and she hugged me at the reception and said she was so glad her dad had found someone. She had an open, easy face, and she laughed a lot. I liked her immediately. I wish I had paid closer attention. The first sign came about 6 weeks after the wedding. Stuart and I were having breakfast on a Sunday, and he asked, casually, the way you ask about the weather, whether I had ever thought about consolidating my properties under a joint account. He framed it as a tax question. He said he'd been reading about spousal income splitting and thought it might be worth exploring. He said it with a piece of toast halfway to his mouth, looking at the newspaper, not at me. I said I'd think about it. I didn't think about it. Instead, I called Dolores that afternoon and told her to keep all correspondence coming to my personal email, not the household one Stuart and I had set up together for bills and shared subscriptions. The second sign came 3 weeks later. We were at his daughter's place for dinner. Renata had made a lovely pasta bake, and we were all sitting around after, having wine. And she turned to me and asked conversationally whether all three of my properties were in Mississauga. I had mentioned at some earlier point that I had properties there. I didn't remember telling her there were three. I kept my face neutral. I said two of them were near there. Yes. I watched her glance at her father. He was looking at his wineglass. I drove home that night with something cold sitting in my chest. I want to tell you what it feels like to start looking at someone you love with a new kind of attention. It's not anger, not at first. It's more like when you're driving on a familiar road and something catches your eye at the edge of it, and you realize the landscape has shifted almost imperceptibly while you weren't looking. You're not sure yet what you're seeing, but you're watching now. I called my accountant, Doug, the following week. I told him I had recently remarried and I wanted to review everything, the corporate structure, the ownership documentation, the beneficiary designations on my insurance policies. He said that was smart and we should have done it before the wedding, which was his gentle way of saying he wished I had called him sooner. I told him I wasn't worried, just being careful. He said careful was good. He walked me through everything. The corporation that held the properties was solely in my name. The mortgages, having been paid off, were gone. My will had not yet been updated for the new marriage, which under Ontario law meant my previous will was revoked upon remarriage, and I needed to act fast. We drafted a new one that week. I made my daughter the sole beneficiary of the properties and the corporate shares. I updated the power of attorney to include a provision that no financial decisions about the corporation could be made without the signature of both me and my estate lawyer. Doug looked at me over his glasses when we were finished and said, "Any particular reason for the urgency?" I said, "Call it intuition." He didn't push. He'd known me for 20 years. The third sign was the one that took my breath away. About 4 months into the marriage, I came home from grocery shopping to find Stuart at the kitchen table with his laptop open and a printed page beside it. He had his reading glasses on, and he was looking at the screen in the particular focused way that means he wasn't just browsing. I set the bags down in the kitchen, and when I came through, he closed the laptop. Not quickly, just deliberately. I said, "What are you looking at?" He said, "Just some property research, thinking about the Streetsville house, whether I should sell." I nodded. I put the canned tomatoes in the cupboard. Later that evening, after he'd gone to watch television, I sat at the kitchen table and I thought about that closed laptop and that printed page. And I thought about the question at breakfast and the look between him and his daughter at the dinner table. And I made a decision. I texted Heloise, "Can you meet tomorrow? I need to think something through." She met me at the coffee shop on Lakeshore the next morning, and I told her everything: the questions, the dinner, the laptop. She listened in that careful way of hers. And then she said, "Vera, when someone starts looking at documents they close when you come in, they are not thinking about their own house." I already knew that. I just needed to hear it out loud. What I did not do, and I want to say this clearly because I have thought about it many times since, was panic. I did not accuse him. I did not confront him. I did not leave, because I wasn't certain yet, and because I am 70 years old now, and I have learned that certainty matters before action. What I did instead was contact a real estate lawyer named Caitlin, who a friend of my daughter's had used in a property dispute. I told her my situation. She confirmed what Doug had told me about the corporate structure and added one thing I hadn't fully understood before: because the properties were held in a corporation, not personally, they did not form part of my net family property under the Family Law Act in the same way personal assets did. If my marriage broke down, the properties themselves were significantly more protected than if I'd held them in my own name. I sat in her office in downtown Mississauga on a Tuesday afternoon and felt something in my shoulders release that I hadn't known I was holding. She also said, "Keep records of anything that feels unusual. Dates, conversations, specific questions. Write it down." I started a small notebook that I kept in the pocket of my winter coat. Things moved faster after that, which tells me in retrospect that something else was moving too. In January, Stuart's daughter came for a visit, just her, without her partner, and she and Stuart spent 2 hours in his home office with the door closed. I made tea and brought it in once. They were looking at something on his computer. They both looked up when I came in with the same slightly startled expression, as though I'd interrupted something, and then they both smiled at exactly the same time. That synchronized smile. I've thought about it many times. I said, "I made chamomile, it's on the table." She said, "Thank you so much." Very warm, very smooth. That night, Stuart told me his daughter was going through some financial difficulties with a property deal that had gone sideways. He said she might need some help, just temporarily, just while things sorted themselves out. He said it the way you float a trial balloon, lightly, watching. He said, "Maybe we could talk about it." I said, "What kind of help?" He said, "She was thinking maybe we could co-sign something, or provide some collateral." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, "I'd need to understand a lot more before I could consider anything like that." He said, "Of course," just thinking out loud. But it wasn't just thinking out loud. I knew it wasn't. I wrote it in my notebook that evening, January 14th. Cosign collateral for Renata. Just thinking out loud. The ask escalated over the next 6 weeks. First, it was collateral. Then it became a conversation about whether I would consider restructuring the corporate ownership to include both our names. For simplicity, he said, for estate purposes. Then, in February, he said very gently that he felt a little strange about the fact that, as my husband, he had so little visibility into my financial affairs. He said it made him feel like he wasn't fully trusted. That word, trusted, I felt it land exactly where he intended it to. I said, "I trust you. I also have a responsibility to my tenants, to the business structure Ron and I built together, and to my own financial future. Those things don't conflict." He said, "I'm your husband." I said, "I know." What I did not say was, "You have been asking me, in different ways, to hand you access to something worth $2 million, and your daughter, who works in real estate and knows what she is looking at, has been in our home looking at documents with you." I did not say that. I sat with it. Instead, I called Caitlin again the next day. I told her I needed to understand my full exposure if Stuart and I separated. She walked me through it. I also, on her advice, began documenting every financial conversation we had, not secretly, I just started writing things down openly, sometimes right in front of him. It had the effect of making those conversations shorter. In March, something broke open. I had gone to my daughter's for a week in Halifax. Her youngest had a birthday, and I wasn't going to miss it. When I came home, I noticed that the filing cabinet in Ron's old study, which I had converted into a home office, had been moved slightly. I would never have noticed except that there's a small scuff on the floor from when Ron had first put it there 20 years ago, and when I came in, I could see the scuff mark was no longer hidden by the cabinet leg. It was about 6 inches to the left. I opened the cabinet. The folders were all there, but they weren't in the order I keep them. I'm meticulous about order. Ron used to tease me about it. Every folder has a specific position, and they were not in their specific positions. I stood in that room for a long time. Then I called Doug and asked him to generate a full audit trail for the corporate account for the past 30 days. He called me back that evening and said everything looked normal, no unauthorized access, nothing had been moved or changed. The documents in that cabinet were mostly old correspondence, nothing that could be used without original signatures and corporate seal. But he had looked. He'd gone through my files while I was in Halifax. I told Caitlin. She said, "It's time to think about what you want to do." I thought about it for 3 days. I went for walks. I sat with Hellies one afternoon, and we didn't talk much, just drank tea and looked at the lake. I thought about the man who had driven me to my eye appointments and listened to me talk about Ron. I thought about whether that had been real or whether it had been something else wearing the face of real. I thought I might never know for certain, and I decided that was okay. What I knew was enough. I asked him to sit down with me one evening in April. I had a cup of tea. He had coffee. I told him, calmly, that I was not comfortable with the direction things have been moving and that I wanted to be honest with him about where I stood. I told him the properties were held in a corporation, that they were protected by legal structures that predated our marriage, and that I had updated my will and power of attorney to reflect my wishes. I told him I was not prepared to restructure the corporation, co-sign for anyone, or provide collateral for any purpose. I watched his face while I said this. It was the first time I had ever seen him look at me with something that was not warmth. It passed quickly, but I saw it. He said, "I didn't realize you had a whole legal setup." I said, "I've had it for 20 years. There was a long silence. He said, "I feel like I've been kept in the dark." I said, "I kept you from details that were not relevant to our shared life. I was never dishonest with you about what I had or who I was." He said, "You told me you had rental properties. You didn't tell me they were worth." He stopped himself. And there it was. He knew the number, or close to it. He had found it somewhere, in the cabinet, or through his daughter's research, or somewhere else. I said, "How do you know what they're worth?" He didn't answer directly. He said, "I just think, as your husband, I deserve to know." I said, "Knowing would have changed things." He said, "What does that mean?" I said, "I think you know what it means." We separated that summer. It wasn't dramatic. There were no screaming matches, no broken dishes. He moved back to Streetsville. His daughter stopped returning my texts, which suited me fine. The divorce process was civil because there was nothing for him to fight over. Caitlin had made sure of that. The morning the final paperwork was signed, I drove to Heloise's house, and we sat on her back porch with coffee and a plate of her shortbread, and I told her it was done. She said, "How do you feel?" I said I felt tired, and also, underneath the tired, something that I could only describe as clean, like a window had been washed. I still have all 3 properties. My tenants are good people. A young family in the Oakville bungalow, a retired teacher in one of the Mississauga units, a nurse and her partner in the other. Dolores still manages the day-to-day. Doug still does my books. My daughter calls every Sunday. Last fall, I flew to Halifax for Thanksgiving, and her youngest taught me a card game that I still don't fully understand, but we play it every time I visit. I am 66 now. I don't know what comes next, and I find that I don't mind not knowing. Ron taught me that a life can turn on a single morning, so you might as well appreciate the ordinary ones. I sometimes think about what would have happened if I had told Stuart everything at the beginning. If I had opened my files and shown him my corporate statements and said, "Here, this is what I have." Maybe nothing would have changed. Maybe I'm wrong about all of it, and I gave up something real for something that was only fear. But I think about that closed laptop. I think about those files moved 6 inches to the left. And I think about his face when I told him about the legal structure, that flash of something that wasn't warmth. I don't think I'm wrong. I think that what I built with Ron, all those years of careful work, of good decisions, of showing up and paying attention, deserved to be protected. And I am the one who protected it. Nobody else. Just me. And the woman I had quietly become over 30 years of building something real. That's enough. That has always been enough. I think about the filing cabinet a lot. Not in an anxious way anymore, more the way you return to a specific image that crystallized something you already knew but hadn't yet put into words. 6 inches to the left. That's all it took. What strikes me now, looking back at everything that unfolded over those months, is how cause and consequence work. Not in some mysterious or cosmic sense, just in the plain, practical way that choices accumulate. Stuart made choices. His daughter made choices. And I'd made mine, years earlier, without knowing I would ever need them. The corporation Ron and I set up in 1998, the careful bookkeeping, the updated will I drafted within days of realizing something was wrong. None of that was luck. It was the result of paying attention for a long time and treating our work as something worth protecting. I don't think Stuart was entirely a bad man. I think he was a man who had found a situation that seemed to offer something easy, and he reached for it. That's a very human thing to do. What I had to ask myself was whether I was going to let it cost me everything Ron and I had spent 30 years building. And the answer, once I sat still long enough to hear it clearly, was no. There's something I want to say about knowing your own worth, not in the abstract self-help sense, but in the specific practical sense of understanding what you have built and refusing to hand it over casually. When I told Stuart about the legal structure that April evening, I wasn't being cold. I was being honest in a way I probably should have been earlier. I was saying, I have a life. I have a history. I have responsibilities that exist outside of this marriage. That isn't a betrayal of intimacy. It's what integrity actually looks like when it has to stand up and be counted. The part I am most proud of is not that I protected the properties, it's that I did it without cruelty, without revenge, without losing myself in the process. I stayed calm. I took notes. I called the right people. I kept going to Halliway's house and drinking tea and watching the lake. I let myself be sad about it because I had genuinely hoped for something real. And losing that hope is a real loss, no matter what else is true. What I know now that I didn't fully understand at 63 is that resilience isn't a feeling, it's a practice. You don't feel strong when you're sitting in a lawyer's office revising your will for the second time in a year. You feel tired and a little heartbroken, but you do it anyway because the alternative is simply not acceptable. That steadiness, the willingness to keep thinking clearly when everything in you wants to either collapse or explode, that is what actually carries you through. I am 66 now. I have my properties, my tenants, my daughter's Sunday calls, a card game I still don't fully understand, and the quiet, particular satisfaction of knowing that what Ron and I built is still intact. That's not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot.